Hello everybody and thanks for joining. Thanks of course to Melvin and the IPI for supporting and hosting this talk. Today I'd like to show you how common sense is effectively a veil covering the truth. I'd like to show you how simple it is for us to remove it, and I'd like to show you what lies underneath, a purely logical view of the universe. By the end of this talk, I hope you'll feel intrigued by the ideas and structures presented, but better yet, I'm hoping you'll feel compelled to investigate them further for yourself. Firstly, I'm going to propose a very simple model of the mind, which we shall use to examine and understand the limitations of common sense. I'll introduce an egoic switch to induce two extremely different states of mind, purely sensible and purely creative. We'll look at some concrete evidence of common sense bias in mathematics, science and religion, and together we'll examine 4 purely logical proofs for the origin and nature of the universe. A new form of mathematics will be proposed, which is necessarily free of common sense bias. I'll suggest how we may write rudimentary expressions of the universe, and I will point out what seems to be the foundational law and algorithm of nature. And together we'll examine the resultant structures and we will consider their possible physical meanings. Firstly then, I'd like to talk about common sense and its limitations. Here I show a simple deduced model of common sense, a sense-making machine. It's a simple control system containing an adaptive common sense model, a model of our worldview trained on sensory input. Its output is our imagined perspective. We literally make sense. Now, if our imagined view of the world well approximates our senses, then there will be little difference between our real sense signals and what is imagined. Consequently, there will be very little error or misconception. We may then say that we have made sense of the world. It is just as we imagined it to be. In this model, then, the adaptive common sense mental model is conscious of the world. It is our consciousness. Now, despite being entirely logical, our common sense models suffer limitations. 1, due to the macroscopic form of our sense organs. For example, we can't directly perceive electrons or quantum states. And 2, due to our common sense models having a selfish perspective, the only perspective available to an individual observer. Let us now introduce a simple model of the ego. For simplicity and to clearly demonstrate its effect, we are modeling it here as a simple switch. When in a closed state, it enables the control loop of our sense-making machines. We become closed-minded, quite literally. If we think of confidence to be the inverse of misconception, then in this mode of thought, we may only feel confident based on what we sense. We become entirely limited by our senses and cannot think creatively. We become purely sensible. In contrast, when the egoic switch is opened, we become totally free of our senses and can then imagine anything we wish. In this literal open-minded state, we run open loop and have full confidence in anything we wish to think of, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. Now, if we assume that our thought structures are always logical, because nature, the supporting infrastructure of our thoughts, is logical, then when the egoic switch is fully opened, we may develop logical thoughts no longer constrained or governed by our senses. We may logically deduce underlying mechanisms, top-down deductive reasoning, and we may logically induce overarching mechanisms or general principles, bottom-up inductive reasoning. I believe this latter mode to be the mode of the so-called mystic, where a quietened mind naturally gives rise to logical thoughts, which are totally unconstrained by common sense. In this mode, logical ideas and solutions simply present themselves once the mind has been sufficiently quietened and primed with a problem. So let's now look at some concrete examples of common sense bias in mathematics. Consider the sum 1 minus 1 equals 0. Here I show a storyboard representation where an invincible balloon represents 1. The grey rectangular regions are the observer's limited and subjective region of consideration. The balloon first enters it, a balloon is gained +1. The balloon then leaves it, a balloon is lost -1. The final result is nothing within the observer's region of consideration, 0. However, note that the lost balloon, being invincible, is still within the bounds of the universe. It is not actually lost. If we expand our region of consideration to the extents of the universe, we will simply observe the movement of the balloon. We would then have a true view of the universe. There would be no sense of gain or loss and no irrationality. Common sense causes us to think selfishly, to consider only what we have within our limited and subjective regions of consideration. It gives rise to the illusion of all numerical operations. We either augment, diminish, or cancel values. We violate value. Let's now consider the so-called real numbers. Consider an irrational number. It cannot be precisely evaluated because it has endless trailing digits. Therefore, it cannot be placed on a number line. Consider a decimal value of 1.5. Its precision is implicit. We simply assume there are endless trailing zeros. We cannot properly represent or evaluate what is implied. We cannot be explicit. Therefore, 1.5 cannot be placed on a number line. Consider a range of values between 1 and 2. A continuous range, a continuous number line, logically requiring no gaps, requires no difference between consecutive numbers. In other words, there can only be the values 1 and 2. And consider no value at all. 0 is not a number, and so it is entirely separate to value. Therefore, there can be no continuum about 0. In conclusion, any value in any base which requires a radix point is in fact irrational. Common sense assigns much context, layers of meaning to our words. However, if we totally relinquish common sense and uphold only logic, all context is removed and we are left with the true meanings of words. We can get at the essence of things. For example, we can logically conclude that nothing and 0 are identical in meaning, despite what common sense would have us believe. If nothing means no thing, then it cannot be related to things. Logically, it cannot possess the context of things. And if 0 means not a value or number, then it must be totally unrelated to values and numbers. Logically, it cannot possess the context of values or numbers. Thus, we have logically proven that nothing and 0 are in fact identical. Our sensible mind will immediately reject this logical proof simply because it doesn't make sense. To understand what the simplest form of thing actually is, we can take a purely logical and complementary approach to the scientific method. We can relinquish common sense and uphold only logic. The simplest form of thing must be other than nothing, yet no more. Therefore, it is merely the very essence of difference, value, separation, etc. In relinquishing common sense, we strip away all layers of context from these words. We can realize that difference, separation, value are in essence exact synonyms. Otherness, other than nothing, separation, difference, value are all the same in essence. The essence of value has no scale. It is simply otherness and no more. Hence, we may write it absolutely and normatively as magnitude 1. Here is another purely logical proof that all things are composed of 1. If things are composed of individual, identical, and indivisible elements, let's say fundamental bricks, then they cannot be overlapped or amalgamated because in doing so we would violate the identity of brick. Consequently, all objects in an analogous brick universe must be composed of separate instances of bricks, even if they are forced to the limit of tessellation. For example, take the brick dog as shown. Pure logic tells us that to divide a brick dog into its constituent bricks requires no action whatsoever, because it is already divided into bricks, even if they are forced to the limit of tessellation. Thus we may simply deduce the denominator of things. A brick dog divided by brick is a brick dog. And in reality we find that all things in our actual universe, when divided by 1, remain unchanged. Therefore, we may conclude that all things in our actual universe are composed of 1. Now, given that all things are composed of 1, then to find the origin of the universe, the answer to the ultimate question, we must simply ask, what is the origin of things? In other words, what is the origin of value? The answer, of course, is simply 0, nothing, because value is simply other than nothing. It is literally a difference from nothing. The conclusion that the creator does not exist resolves the problem of the creator paradox. Furthermore, the uncreated creator, being the origin of all value, is literally at the center of all things, which includes every cell of our bodies and deeper still. Now here's an exciting idea, to say the least. Given all things are composed of one, and assuming the universe is intrinsically logical, and assuming we can develop a new purely logical mathematics, then we should be able to develop direct symbolic representations of the universe. So let's give it a try. So let's start with magnitude 1, of which everything is composed, and let's start by examining it from a common sense perspective. It has many meanings. For example, we may say -1 and +1 both present a magnitude of 1. We may say all points on a unit circle present a magnitude of 1. Traditionally, we treat it as an after-the-fact descriptor of such relative values. A magnitude of 1 may be assigned once certain values are expressed. As such, an evaluation of 1 simply doesn't make any sense. So let's again remove the veil of common sense. Let us consider magnitude 1 only logically. In doing so, we find that we can actually evaluate magnitude 1 by starting naturally in a single dimension. Thus, magnitude 1 may be considered a causal seed which may be expressed. As will be proposed, this seed is at the foundation of quantum mechanics, the very cause of probability and possibility, quantum superposition, and entanglement. This logical view of magnitude 1 provides the basis for a new purely logical mathematics, which we shall now examine together. But wait a minute, we forgot to take into account our previous logical conclusions. Earlier, we proved the origin of things is 0, and we proved the simplest form of thing is magnitude 1. Clearly then, in our haste, we allowed common sense to mislead us. Let us then take a step back and take 0 into account, the first link in what seems to be nature's unidirectional causal chain. Introducing deismatics. It needed a name, so I chose deismatics for obvious reasons, but let's not dwell on a name. It is essentially our standard mathematics, but with the region of consideration expanded to the extents of the universe. A mathematics with a universal perspective rather than a personal perspective. As such, there are no numerical operations, and there are only the relative expressions of 1. It is a mathematics wherein magnitude 1 is to be fully respected, that is, logically expressed to the fullest extent possible. Indeed, we shall make that our maxim. We shall start as simply as possible by expressing magnitude 1 in a single dimension. In doing so, we arrive at two possibilities, +1 and -1. Firstly, note that we are treating magnitude 1 as a causal seed. Secondly, note that within deismatics, value is conserved and so there are no numerical operators. Thirdly, note that a means of separation was already instinctively applied between the possibilities +1 and -1. In the above form, that means of separation is indicated by a comma. As such, what we have written is in fact a two-dimensional expression of magnitude 1. Consequently, we may think of magnitude 1 as being the possibilities plus and -1 superposed. We must of course consider all permutations of magnitude 1 in order to respect its full identity, to fully express it and define it. The second expression on this page shows both permutations combined, but then a problem arises. We show 4 distinct possibilities, yet we have only used 2 individual notes, +1 and -1. As such, we are not respecting the individuality of the 4 possibilities. We therefore need to introduce a further means of separation, which allows the possibilities to be set apart relatively, whilst respecting their absolute identity. The only logical solution is to introduce a further dimension. We shall refer to these sets of 4 orthogonal possibilities as quotients. There are of course 4 factorial, 24, permutations that we need to keep track of. Importantly, there are no numerical, mathematical, or logical operators in deismatics or reality. Plus I and minus I simply denote two opposing possibilities which are relatively independent of plus 1 and minus 1. While the specific permutation shown seems to involve rotation, we should remind ourselves of its true nature. It is simply a sequence of discrete, individual and separate possibilities of 1. If one were to state there is clearly rotation in some sense, they should take themselves literally. Rotation, and indeed all operations, are merely apparent, sensible notions. Now each quotient must be expressed ad infinitum to provide the fullest possible expression of 1. Our maxim has given rise to a natural tendency. The expression must continue eternally. Now that we have logically arrived at 24 unique quotients which must be expressed eternally, let us consider how we arrived here. We upheld a simple maxim: magnitude 1 is to be fully respected, that is, logically expressed to the fullest possible extent. Now, given we have already proven 0 to be the origin and cause of magnitude 1, we may now logically deduce the fundamental law of nature. Respect the identity of 0. In doing so, we will in turn respect the identity of magnitude 1 and all things. Indeed, we may further logically deduce that 0 is logic and all things are logical. We are logical. We are expressions of logic. 0. Furthermore, from an inspection of our previous steps, it seems logic demands a natural two-step recursive algorithm. 1. A new dimension is required to express the parent identity, resulting in a new generation, a new set of children, a new set of possibilities. Number 2. All children must be individually respected. They must be set apart relatively and permuted, that is, arranged in accordance with logic. The resultant children become the parents of the next generation, and so forth. Let us consider a possible physical meaning of what we have so far expressed. Now, in accordance with logic, 0, we may not repeat, that is, re-express possibilities. Therefore, we must begin our expressions from an available end and progress only contiguously and unidirectionally. Hence, we must begin at the temporal origin. We may therefore conclude that it is logic which requires a unidirectional arrow of time. Let us further consider the nature of time in accordance with logic. It is a required means of separation between possibilities. It has a duration of magnitude 1. It is necessarily orthogonal to the possibilities. It is necessarily unidirectional. We have so far used a comma to represent it, but let's also use plus j. The nature of time is fundamentally different to that of the possibilities. The origin of the possibilities remains fixed in the 1I plane in which they are struck. However, the origin of time unidirectionally increments in the j dimension in which it is struck. Finally, as mentioned, the possibilities remain localized about their origin in the 1I plane, eternally repeating their specific 4-part patterns. If we assume the possibilities to be spatial, because our expressions do need spatial content, then the particular expression shown describes a quantized helical spacetime structure. Thus we have arrived at a logical explanation for the source and existence of information, that is, all things in our universe. We also have a clear view of how to continue our deismatical expressions. We have apparently discovered a natural recursive algorithm which generates all things. So let's now take stock of what we have so far uncovered. The following 3 pages show 24 quotients and 48 octions, which are valid pairs of quotients having orthogonally related possibilities. These pairings are logical. They are required by logic, 0. Hence, there are 72 quantum objects for any given expression of magnitude 1. Thus, there are 72 factorial permutations, that is, 72 factorial instances of 1, which must be expressed in accordance with logic. Here are shown the 24 quotients grouped into 3 characters. Spin is calculated as the number of contiguous rotations divided by 4, the number of states per quotient. The type A quotients exhibit contiguous rotation and have a spin of 1. I should say apparent rotation. I presume they are essentially bosonic. The type B quotients have a spin of 1/2. They exhibit both quadrature rotations and flips, which I presume to be Lorentz boosts. I presume they are essentially spinorial and fermionic. The type C quotients are similar. Here I show the 48 auctions, which are valid pairings of the quotients in an orthogonal relationship. They are grouped into 6 characters. There are spin 0, spin 1/2, and spin 1 objects. Of particular interest are the type 1A not A auctions and the type 2A not A auctions. They appear to be bispinorial. I show them having a spin of 0. The type B auctions are also essentially bispinorial, and I show them having a spin of 0. And here is an overview of the 72 quantum objects. The structure is rich. 6 of the characters have anti-characters, 3 apparently don't. I do not want to dwell much on this particular classification in case it is not helpful for those who may be considering a potential mapping to the standard model. The essence of quantum mechanics. Now, magnitude 1 simply denotes a magnitude of 1. It is absolute and therefore cannot provide any relative information. In other words, it cannot dictate whether +1 will be expressed before -1. Consequently, the likelihood of obtaining +1 first is simply equal to the likelihood of obtaining -1 first. Thus we have identified the cause of probability in our universe. It is driven by logic, the fundamental law of nature. It is required by 0. Note how common sense suggests there is a hidden variable in play. Now, if +1 is first expressed, then we know that -1 must follow it because it is the only other possibility of magnitude 1 in the two-dimensional form shown. Thus, we have identified the cause of entanglement in our universe. It is driven by logic, the fundamental law of nature. It is required by 0. And finally, note how common sense suggests a superposition of states. Suggestions for further work. As mentioned, there are some immediate next steps in accordance with logic which result in the quotients and auctions being manifested in 3 different forms: massive, energetic, and informational. There are 3 valid alternate means of separation between the possibilities: time only, time and space only. An attempt to map the quotients and auctions to the standard model seems an obvious next step. Please help. If both the universe and Deus matrix are fundamentally logical, and the expressions of one are in fact direct symbolic representations of nature, then we should be able to further describe the universe, or at least manageable portions of it, by furthering those expressions. If Deus matrix suffers no impairment, our descriptions of the universe may be limited only by computational power. It seems reasonable to expect, due to the current limits of computational technology, we may only be able to accurately emulate small portions of the very early universe. We may need to apply artificial boundary conditions to emulate later structures. However, there of course remains a more pressing problem on planet Earth. We are still fighting, right now, to protect our technology, our intellectual property, our beliefs, our economies. We have irrationally progressed to 90 seconds to midnight because our traditional belief systems are not wholly logical. We have a choice then: stay in our regiment and continue our march, which seems to be leading us towards annihilation, or recognize our situation and take logical steps to improve it. Thank you for your time.